She didn't say it once. She said it like a sentence she had practiced, sharpened, and repeated every time I failed to meet her standard of success. The words, "You are my biggest disappointment," echoing in my ears like a curse I couldn't scrub clean from my soul. I remember sitting at the edge of my childhood bed, fingers curled tightly around a rejection letter from yet another publisher, and hearing her footsteps in the hallway, each step sounding like judgment closing in. When she opened the door, she didn't ask how I was doing or what the letter said. She looked at the crumpled paper in my hand, rolled her eyes, and sighed like my dreams were making her tired. "You're wasting your life with this writing nonsense," she said, arms folded across her chest like a wall I was never allowed to climb. Didn't reply, just stared at the lines I had written, the ones no one wanted to read, and felt the invisible weight of all the expectations I had failed to meet pressing down on my chest like a slow, steady crush. She used to tell her friends I was finding myself, a phrase coded in condescension, a lie that really meant my child refuses to be what I wanted. I worked night shifts at a coffee shop, where the smell of burnt espresso and old milk clung to my clothes like a second skin, scribbling paragraphs on napkins during slow hours while pretending I didn't care how tired I was. Each word I wrote was like lighting a match in the dark and praying the flame wouldn't flicker out before I could finish the sentence. She never asked to read anything I wrote, not once, though she knew I was trying, knew I was fighting for something even if it wasn't what she believed was worth fighting for. There was a night I called her after finishing the first draft of my novel, my voice trembling with hope and fear, and all she said was, "Are you still doing that?" The way she said that, like writing was some contagious illness I should have outgrown by now, made me feel smaller than the blinking cursor that had haunted my laptop for months. I hung up without answering, knowing the silence would say more than any word I could muster. Years passed like fog, sometimes so thick I couldn't see the point of going on, sometimes so thin I glimpsed moments of joy between all the failure. I wrote and rewrote and deleted and wrote again, carving pieces of my soul into stories no one saw, stories that bled from a place deeper than I had ever dared to share. I had no agent, no connections, just a finished book and a stubborn pulse that refused to give up. When I self-published it, I told no one, especially not her. The first few weeks, nothing happened. A trickle of readers, a few kind reviews, and then a quiet buzz, the kind of whisper that grows slowly, secretly. Then someone famous tweeted about it. Then it hit a niche book club. Then it landed on a podcast. And suddenly, it was everywhere. Watched the sales numbers grow while sitting in the same coffee shop I used to mop floors in, tears stinging my eyes as I realized it was happening. It was really happening. The day my book hit #1, I sat in my car outside my mother's house for 20 minutes, rehearsing a version of the conversation that didn't end in either of us, crying. When she opened the door, she was already holding her phone, the screen glowing with my name in bold letters beneath the words, #1 bestseller. "I saw it," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard, like she was afraid of breaking the moment. I braced myself for sarcasm, for some thinly veiled remark about how lucky I got. But instead, she pulled me into a hug, the first real hug in years, and whispered, "I'm so proud of you," like she was confessing a secret she'd been too stubborn to say before. And then, before I could even respond, she pulled back and added, "I've been telling everyone at church that you're a famous author now." Her smile was wide, her eyes shimmering with pride, but I couldn't help but feel the strange, quiet ache of all the years I had begged for those words when they would have meant the most. Still, I nodded and smiled, because for the first time, I wasn't the disappointment anymore. I was her bragging point. And even though the scars from her words still lived beneath my skin, I had finally written my way out of the silence she had wrapped around me for so long. The days that followed felt surreal, like I was walking through a life that used to belong to someone else, someone who hadn't spent years being told they weren't enough. Suddenly, people who had never replied to my messages before were tagging me in stories, congratulating me in public, quoting lines from a book they never knew I had poured my soul into. My inbox overflowed with interview requests, podcast invites, and messages from readers who said my words had reached places inside them no one else had ever touched. Strangers cried over my characters, said they saw themselves in the pages I had written alone in the dark while doubting everything about myself. But beneath all the noise, all the praise, there was a silence I couldn't ignore. The echo of all the times I had stared at the ceiling of my tiny apartment, wondering if I was just pretending to be a writer. I remembered the months I couldn't afford groceries, when dinner was instant noodles and lunch was coffee refills at work, and I told myself hunger was just a temporary sacrifice. I remembered checking my phone obsessively for rejection emails, each one a confirmation that maybe my mother had been right all along. "You need to be realistic," she'd always say, and I would wonder what realism even meant when my reality felt like drowning slowly in expectations I could never fulfill. Now she was posting my book cover on Facebook with long captions about my journey and how she always believed in me, even though we both knew that wasn't true. I'd stare at those posts, reading her pride as if it were written in a foreign language, trying to translate the memory of her saying, "I just don't get why you think anyone would care what you write." My friends would send me screenshots of her comments, things like, "This is the book my daughter wrote. It's amazing. I always knew she had it in her," and ask me if I was okay. I'd type replies like, "Ha ha," or "Yeah, funny, right?" But inside I felt something sharp and sad twisting in a place I didn't have words for. It was like watching a movie where the villain turns into a cheerleader halfway through, and no one acknowledges the damage she did in the first half. She started calling me more often, her voice warm now, lined with affection I hadn't heard since I was a child. She asked about my next book, suggested I write about our family, joked about playing herself in the movie adaptation like she hadn't once told me my writing was selfish. Every time I talked to her, I wanted to scream, "Where were you when I needed just one kind word?" But the words caught in my throat like glass. I smiled through the phone, thanked her for her support, even laughed sometimes, because it was easier than digging into the mess we had built between us. My therapist asked me once, "Do you want her love now, or do you want her to understand how much she hurt you?" And I couldn't answer, because the truth was, I wanted both, and I didn't believe I'd get either. There was one night, late, when I was rereading the first draft of the book, and I found a sentence that had nearly been cut. "Some wounds don't heal, they just stop bleeding." And I thought of her face the day she told me I was a disappointment, and her face the day she told me she was proud, and I wondered which one was more real. Maybe they both were. Maybe love and harm can live in the same person, tangled like roots beneath a tree that looks strong on the surface. I wanted to believe she meant it now, the pride, the joy, but a part of me still flinched when she said my name like she hadn't once used it like a weapon. And yet, here I was, her daughter, the writer, the one who had made it after all. The world had shifted, tilted in my favor, but inside, I was still trying to find my balance. The success I had dreamed of didn't erase the pain. It just made it quieter, made it echo in a different room. And now that she had claimed me as her pride, I had to decide what part of that was mine to hold. Because I had built this life, with hands that trembled in defiance of her doubts, and now she wanted to stand on the foundation like she had laid the bricks herself. I wasn't angry, not exactly, but I was something else, something deeper and older than rage, something that felt like standing in the ashes of a home that burned while someone smiled and pointed at the blue sky above it. And the hardest part wasn't forgiving her, it was figuring out how to love her now that she wanted to be the mother of someone she once refused to see. The book tour started 2 months after the bestseller announcement. A blur of hotels, airports, bookstore podiums, and late-night signings where readers told me their secrets like I had written pages straight from their veins. At every stop, someone would ask about my inspiration, and I'd smile and say something poetic about resilience or identity or love. But I never mentioned her, never said how the ache of being unloved by your own mother can hollow out a story you spend years trying to fill. People called me brave, said my voice was powerful, but they didn't know that every sentence had been written by someone who used to cry in the bathroom, so no one would hear how deeply she believed she was nothing. Sometimes I caught myself scanning the crowd for her, even though I knew she wasn't there. Other times, she'd call after an event, say things like, "I saw pictures, you looked beautiful," and I'd wonder if she had ever said that to me before my name was in a headline. The first time she came, to one of my signings, it was in my hometown, and the air was thick with ghosts. She sat in the front row, smiling with a pride that looked convincing to everyone but me, holding my book like it was something holy. I almost forgot my speech when I saw her face, so familiar, so distant, like a photograph taken years ago that you're not sure you want to frame. She stood in the signing line, right behind a teenage girl who clutched her copy with shaking hands and told me that my story saved her. And when it was my mother's turn, she handed me a book she hadn't bought. She had taken mine from the living room shelf and asked me to sign it to the one who always believed. I stared at the page, pen frozen, 1,000 memories crashing into my lungs all at once. Believed? Belief didn't sound like slammed doors and cold silences, like being told I was wasting my time, like being 13 and hiding poems under my bed because I knew she'd laugh if she found them. I wrote, "To Mom," and nothing else because the lie hurt too much to spell out in ink. That night I drank cheap hotel wine and cried so hard I had to bite a towel to keep from waking the guests in the room next door. And I kept thinking about all the versions of me that had been starved. Of her love, how they still lived somewhere inside me, waiting for a moment she would never give them. She posted a photo of us from the event, captioned it with something about dreams coming true and how proud she was, and it got hundreds of likes. Everyone commented about how lucky I was to have such a supportive mom, and I just scrolled through them in silence, feeling like I was watching someone else's life unfold. My publicist asked if I wanted to include her in the documentary being filmed about my journey, said it could be powerful to show that full circle moment, but I said no because I didn't. Want a performance? I wanted the truth, and the truth was complicated and full of cracks, not easily edited into a feel-good ending. The more visible I became, the more people expected me to be healed, whole, grateful, not just for the success, but for the pain that shaped it. And I was grateful, in a way, but not for her cruelty. I was grateful for my own stubbornness, for the nights I didn't give up, for the fire that kept burning even when she tried to snuff it out. I was grateful that I had loved myself enough, even when she didn't, to keep going. But I couldn't erase what had been said, the years of shame she had draped over me like a second skin. One morning, I found an old voicemail from years ago, from a day I had submitted a manuscript and called her just to hear her voice. She hadn't answered, but her message was still there. "I hope this writing phase ends soon. You're not meant for this kind of thing." I listened to it 3 times, each time feeling a mix of fury and sadness that made my chest ache. Then I deleted it, not because I was ready to let go, but because I didn't want that voice living in my pocket anymore. She had started referring to herself as the mother of the author, like it was a title she had earned instead of one she had abandoned for years. She told people at the grocery store about my achievements, held up her phone to show them interviews she hadn't watched. It was like I had become her redemption story, proof she couldn't be a bad mother if her child had succeeded. But deep down, I knew what it had cost me to get here. And I knew that success didn't undo damage. It just gave you better tools to live with the ruins. And when I looked in the mirror now, I didn't see a disappointment or a daughter waiting for approval. I saw a woman who had turned pain into power, who had written her own rescue. And even though my mother had changed her tone, she would never understand the weight of that journey. Not truly, not the way I did. It was autumn when the movie rights sold, and the leaves outside my window looked like they were catching fire just to celebrate me. Bright oranges and reds tumbling through the air like confetti. No one had to clean up. I signed the contract with shaking hands. The kind of tremble that comes not from fear, but from something holy. Like your younger self is sitting beside you, watching it happen, crying silently. I called a few people, the ones who had always believed, the ones who read early drafts and sent pizza when I was broke and clapped for me when no one else cared to. I didn't call her, but she found out anyway. Of course she did. And the next morning, my phone was full of texts from people saying, "Your mom is over the moon," and "She told us you're going to Hollywood." I opened my social media and saw a post with an old photo of me at age 5, wearing a Halloween costume I made from paper and tape, captioned with, "From day one, I knew she was going to be something special." I stared at it, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel anger. I felt hollow, like the space she had once carved out in me was now just a dim echo. She wanted credit for the seed, but she hadn't watered it, hadn't shielded it from the cold. She had watched me grow through the cracks in the sidewalk and only began clapping when I bloomed. I thought about the apology I would never get, the real one. Not just, "I'm proud of you," but "I'm sorry I didn't believe in you. I was wrong. I hurt you." But I knew it wasn't coming. And so I did what writers do. I wrote her into my next book. Not as a villain, not exactly, but as a woman who loved control more than connection, who wrapped her insecurities in expectations and called it parenting. Gave that character flaws and fears and softness she never let me see in real life, because fiction was the only place I could make her human again. When the book came out, it was called The Ones Who Loved Us Wrong, and it hit the top 5 in its first week. Reviews poured in, saying it was raw, vulnerable, powerful. People said, "This helped me understand my mother." And quietly, secretly, I hoped maybe she would read it and understand herself. She called a few days later, voice quieter than usual, like she had walked barefoot through the pages and wasn't sure how to speak again. "You wrote about me, didn't you?" she asked, and I said, "I wrote about how it felt." There was silence on the line, long, stretching, heavy. Then she whispered, "I didn't know it hurt you that much. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to." She added, "I wish I'd done better." And maybe that wasn't a full apology, but it was something, like the smallest light flickering in the distance after years of dark. I told her I was working on a new story, one about a girl who learns to carry her scars like trophies. She said she'd like to read it someday, and for the first time, I believed her. Not because she had changed completely, but because I had, because I no longer needed her approval to feel worthy, because I no longer let her voice drown out my own. I had written through the pain, bled onto pages, and built a life with words no one else believed in. I had turned disappointment into defiance, silence into sentences, rejection into resurrection. And now, when people say, "Your mom must be so proud," I smile and say, "I am too," because she is no longer the narrator of my story. I am, and I've made it one worth reading.